What are two of the dirtiest words in the English language? Well, if you're concerned with global warming, as so many people are these days, the answer is obvious. The two words are carbon dioxide, or as it is known by its chemical symbol, CO2. One atom of carbon and two atoms of oxygen. If we pump much more of it into the atmosphere, the argument goes, we're going to alter the climate, catastrophically. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, which constitute 85% of our energy use, must be reduced to zero by 2100. If we don't save ourselves from ourselves, we're toast. That's the claim. We're actually living in a low carbon dioxide era. The optimum level of CO2 for plant growth, for example, is 4 to 5 times what is currently found in our atmosphere. That's why greenhouse growers worldwide actually inject additional CO2 into their greenhouses. They want to promote plant growth. Likewise, higher CO2 levels in the global atmosphere will boost food and forest productivity. In fact, we're already seeing the positive effects of increased carbon dioxide now. Satellite measurements have noted the greening of the earth as crops and forests grow due to our higher levels of CO2. It turns out that carbon dioxide are not dirty words after all. We should celebrate CO2 as the giver of life that it is.
We have some global warming, no doubt about it, but it may not be as bad as we originally thought because there are other contributing factors. I started looking into the idea that weather stations have been slowly encroached upon by urbanization and siting issues over the last century, meaning that our urbanization affected the temperature. And this was something that was very clear if you looked at the temperature records. Anyone who's ever stood next to a building in the summertime at night, a brick building that's been out in the summer sun, if you stand next to it at night, you can feel the heat radiating off of it. That's a heat sink effect. And over the last 100 years, our country, in fact the world, has changed. We've gone from having mostly a rural agrarian society to one that is more urban and city-based. And as a result, the infrastructure has increased. We've got more freeways, more airports, we've got more buildings, more streets, all these things. Those are all heat sinks. During the day, solar insolation hits these objects and these surfaces, and it stores heat in these objects. At night, it releases that heat. Now, if you are measuring temperature in a city that went from having maybe 10% of non-permeable surface to maybe 90% over 100 years, that's a heat sink effect, and that should show up in the record. Some people don't respond well to scare tactics, and there have been some scare tactics used by some of the proponents on the other side of the issue. And that's where the overselling of it comes in. Oh, it's definitely become too politicized. In fact, some of the scientists who are the leaders in the issue have become, for lack of a better word, political tools on the issue. So the people that like more regulation use global warming as a tool and the means to an end. And so as a result, we might be getting more regulation and more taxes that really aren't rooted in science, but more in politics.
Well, I think the main benefit of CO2 is it's the food for plants. Plants really need three things. They need light for photosynthesis, they need water, and they need CO2. Plants are made of carbon. When I hear about carbon pollution, we're all made of carbon. Plants are made of carbon, people are made of carbon, your hamburger's made of carbon. But CO2 is used by plants. If you go to a cornfield, for example, in midsummer, and you measure CO2, it's about half what it would be at night because the corn plant has sucked so much CO2 out of the air that it's now limited on how fast it can make new sugar and grow by the amount of CO2. So if you double the CO2, the corn can grow better. There's more of it there. It doesn't suck it down so quickly. So that's number one, is it's an essential plant food. There's huge amounts of water used in photosynthesis now, more than should be, because we're essentially in a CO2 famine. If you look at the
We're in a CO2 famine.
Famine. We have too little CO2.
So at 400 parts per million.
400 is still too small. Yeah. Yeah, if you look at the geological history of the world, you know, we started getting good fossils about 550 million years ago, the Cambrian.
Yeah.
Since that time, CO2 levels have averaged thousands of parts per million, not a few hundred parts per million, you know, much, much higher, factors of 4, 5, 10 even. And so plants really evolved when there was a lot more CO2 to eat. You know, now they don't have enough. And you can see lots of evidence for that. There's certain plants, for example, that they're called C4 plants that are adapted to the low CO2 levels we have now. They typically are in hot regions of the earth. Sugarcane is an example. Corn, American corn, maize is another example. But most of our agricultural plants use the old-fashioned photosynthesis, which is called C3. And that's a more efficient way to operate if you have plenty of CO2, but there isn't plenty of CO2 anymore. There's not enough. So as CO2 levels have been going up, the old-fashioned C3 plants, and that includes soybeans and weeds and cotton, actually most plants are C3. They're doing very, very well. I mean,
With
even
an increase in CO2.
With the increase in CO2, very, very noticeable. It's a huge effect. You know, it's worth hundreds of billions of dollars every year in agricultural productivity. So when people talk about the social cost of carbon, it's absurd. You know, the social cost is negative of CO2. Now,
Because it's a net contributor
it's a net contributor to agricultural productivity.
Arga is driving growth in the agricultural sector by adding carbon dioxide to increase production capacity and guarantee large, attractive flowers and vegetables such as cucumbers, tomatoes and lettuce. Using carbon dioxide fertilization increases yield by up to 30%. Ambient air has a carbon dioxide concentration of 400 ppm. This is sufficient for growing tomatoes and cucumbers, but as the plants, often grown in greenhouses, start to consume the carbon dioxide in the air at first sunlight, if the concentration of carbon dioxide is allowed to fall, growth is slowed down or halted.
CO2 in greenhouses is very important because we get a better crop, a higher yield and better quality of the tomatoes.
Additional carbon dioxide needs to be added to increase efficiency and to have the optimal yield. By keeping the carbon dioxide concentration in the greenhouse atmosphere in a range of 600 to 1000 ppm, the best growth rate can be expected. When extra carbon dioxide is added to greenhouse air, the tomato, cucumber and lettuce yield improves by up to 30% or even more.
I don't think there are any real downsides. I mean, if you look at the arguments, the initial argument was there's going to be this rapid global warming. It hasn't happened. So it's very clear that the models have enormously exaggerated the warming potential.
Why has that happened? What is it about the models that when you simulate it, it works and you say, well, there it is?
Well, I mentioned the saturation of CO2. You know, if you paint the barn red, if you put another coat, it's not any redder than it was before. And they noticed that early on, that CO2 has this problem that, you know, it's disappointing that it doesn't seem to make much difference if you add. So they invented all sorts of feedback mechanisms that would amplify the effect of additional CO2. Water vapor, clouds, all sorts of things were supposed to be triggered by the CO2. They don't seem to be happening.
But water vapor is a dominant greenhouse gas anyway.
Water vapor is the main greenhouse gas, water vapor and clouds.
My own journey with trying to understand climate science started when I watched Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth.
Yeah.
Mr. Gore says that if you take water vapor out of the equation, and he says it rather casually, if you take water vapor out of the equation, CO2 makes up 30% of greenhouse gases. And I went, holy smokes. So I started to do some investigation and went, okay, well, he's right about that, but you can't take water vapor out of the equation. And you can't, and if you do, are you then not negating the dynamic interaction between CO2, methane, water vapor, and the other greenhouse gases that are involved?
Yeah. No, of course you can't take water vapor out, and you should always be careful to say water vapor and clouds. Clouds are big deal.
How come? What makes them a big deal?
Well, if you just go to space and look at the Earth, you don't see the ground over big fractions of the Earth. All you see is clouds.
But
So
if
the
you
Earth
take a
is
look,
covered, you know,
but
it's
if you take a look at the Earth, that beautiful blue bubble or marble in space,
It's marble because the white part of the marble is clouds.
but that image that's on Al Gore's book doesn't show so much cloud cover as a result of global warming.
Well, yeah, that bothered Al, so he airbrushed a lot of the clouds out. You know, if you look at the original papers, they have many more clouds. I don't think there's anything to worry about from more CO2. I'll say it again, that I think more CO2 will be good for the world, that our great-great-children will look back and say, thank God we've got all this CO2. You know, what foresighted people our ancestors were.
The various stated definitions of the greenhouse gas effect have been subjected to the rigorous scrutiny and application of the fundamental laws of physics and thermodynamics. They were found to be unreal, and unless some new definition can be put forward that satisfies and complies with those laws, it can only be concluded that the concept of a greenhouse gas or a greenhouse effect has not been demonstrated and is thus without merit. That's according to Martin Herzberg and other authors, the role of greenhouse gases in climate change. According to Nassif Nala, Director of Scientific Research Division at Biology Cabinet Mexico, carbon dioxide behaves as a coolant of the Earth's surface and the Earth's atmosphere. It does this by reducing the amount of heat that can be absorbed by the atmospheric gases and also the amount that can be re-emitted.
Hello, I'm here making this video today because I am angry. I'm furious in fact, at those who believe that the best way to protect our planet, or to combat climate change, is to fill the minds of young people such as myself, and even younger than myself, with what I can only describe as senseless doomsday propaganda. Now, I know that just by hearing me say that, some people will already have labelled me a denier. What I have an issue with is how the mass media has twisted and misrepresented the science to create an absolutely absurd scare story, a scare story that's affected billions of people across the world. We've reached a point in this whole thing where, because of the media's senseless doomsaying and misrepresentation of science, millions of young people all over the world are fully convinced that they are living in the end times. They're convinced that the collapse is coming and that there's no point in studying for the future or in having dreams and hope, because they believe that the world is ending soon and that they're all going to die in anything from 12 years to 30 years to as little as 18 months. It's got to the point where eco-anxiety, as they put it, has been classified as an actual mental health disorder. People are worried so sick about the supposed climate change apocalypse that they're being put on medication because of it. Young people are asking themselves if it's even worth studying or going to university anymore. And children as young as 6 or 7 are being terrified by climate change. Apparently, according to a psychotherapist, one mother has even reportedly fantasized about killing her child because she fears for the future because of climate change. How is this even remotely okay or acceptable?
According to some, there's a climate catastrophe. The zealots all accept it with alacrity. Extinction Rebellion's in my nasal cavity. Even Prince Harry thinks it's blasphemy to have more than 2 kids in his royal family. The BBC have clarified that our planet's on the edge of a genocide. The mainstream media are preoccupied, and the United Nations has identified that the cause of the problem is carbon dioxide. Are polar bears dying of global warming? Greta's given us a 12-year warning. In 12 years' time she'll be mortified that she blamed it all on carbon dioxide. Sailing to America, windward side, and the crew flew back, it's verified. According to some, there's a climate catastrophe. Extinction Rebellion on TV nationally. They dress up for the cameras so shabbily, blocking roads as part of their strategy. We've got to get to work for the economy. If we can't get to work, we face bankruptcy. Mr. Broccoli on Good Morning TV doesn't have much to say, but has the audacity to tell us how to live. What vanity. Blocking commuter trains is never justified. If you drive or fly, you are crucified. You are ostracised with the new apartheid. How a single gas named carbon dioxide heats up the planet is never specified.